Next, let's talk about backbone views, which will act as our presentation layer, which means that they're going to manage all the visual information from the browser view. And in Backbone, since we don't have controllers in the way that you would have in a typical traditional MVC, the views in Backbone kind of inherit some of the controller's job also. So they're going to be taking input from the user and determining how it should then update the model. And it's also listening for changes on the model, which will then update the presentation layer. So let's just take a look at some of the slides we'll run through, and we'll familiarize ourselves with the syntax first, and then later on we'll go and actually code this in and see how it works in practice. So to define a new view, same as a lot of the other Backbone objects, here we just create a global variable to hold that information. In this case, I'm creating a dog view. Now, it is a standard practice that if you have a model called dog and you wanted to make a corresponding view for the dog model, you would call that dog view. So again, the dog model would be sort of the business logic or the data for each instance of a dog. And to handle the view or the presentation of how we show or display that dog information to the user, we would create a dog view. So to create a dog view, what we've done here is we've just set it equal to backbone.view.extend. And to overwrite the defaults here, we just pass in a plain old JavaScript object here using curly braces. Backbone views by default have an EL property, which stands for element. And this designates the element that the view will render into. And there's quite a few different possibilities for how you can label the element that you'd like the Backbone view to be associated with. The most common thing to do is to use either tag name or class name or ID, which you can see here. And what these will do is they will create an element to render the view into. So this could be an element that's not yet inserted in the DOM. It's an element that will exist in memory, and then later on when we render the view, it will take this element and along with any content that's inside of it and then render that into the DOM. So if we use tag name, it allows us to specify just an HTML element that should be associated with this view. And the default is div. If you just leave all of these empty or you don't specify a tag name, class name, or ID, it will just give you an empty div. And you're also free to set this to any valid HTML element, and you just pass it in as a string. We also have class name, and for class names here, it does exactly what you might guess. You just put the name of the class and it will create an element with that particular class name. And here we have ID, which, as you could guess, allows you to create an ID on that element. So if we did all three of these here, it would actually create a div with both an ID of dog and a class name of adopted. So again, if you use any of these particular properties, tag name, class name, or ID, it will actually create an element in memory that we can render into the DOM later on. Now, if you already have an existing element in the DOM that you'd simply like to render the view into, you can just use the EL property directly and set it to a element that already exists in the DOM, and it will just sort of swap out or replace the content in that element whenever you render. Just like models and collections, we do have the initialize method that we can add in to any Backbone view, and this gives us access to the moment in time, or that hook in time, when a new view is created. Here you can just see that we are selecting the element that we mentioned before. This is the element that's associated with the view. And one neat thing that Backbone gives you is if you prefix the EL property with the $, it will actually give you a jQuery cached copy of that element. So here in this previous example, we had pointed the element to the main element, which is an HTML5 semantic element that's already existing in the DOM. So then here on initialize, when we call this $EL, the $sign creates a jQuery selection of the main element in the DOM. And then we're able to call jQuery methods after that. And in this case, we're appending a string of text into the main element. Now, another really common thing to do in the initialize method inside of views is to set up event binding on the model that's associated with that view. So in this case, each dog model is associated with its own particular dog view. And we set a property on the view called model. And this is typically done whenever you create an instance of a dog from the dog model. You'll oftentimes set it to have a particular view associated with it. This way you can call .view on any model and you can see which view is associated. And also, likewise with views, you can call model on a view to see the model that's associated with it. So in this case, by saying this.model, we're actually referring to the model that's associated with this view. And we're using the on method to listen for event changes. And here we're binding to the string change, which means any change at all on this model. So anytime the model associated with this view is updated, we're going to call the render method on this view. And as a third argument here, we're able to pass in the context for what this should point to. So in the case of rendering, we're calling it from the context of this, meaning this instance of the dog view. As we mentioned before, one of the important jobs of a backbone view is to listen for particular DOM events. And whenever those events occur, we can then call particular methods that are built into our instance of our view. So in this case, we've set the element of our view to an element inside the DOM that already exists that has the ID of dog. And then in order to listen for events within this element, we can create this events property here. And we just pass this a simple JavaScript object here. You can see the opening and closing curly brace here and here. And it's really quite simple and straightforward. The way that we set up events is we create a property name inside of the events object here. And we can pass this a particular event name type, and then we can then pass it a specific selector to listen for that event on. Okay, so it's important to understand here that this selector button hashtag name, which of course means a button that has the ID of name, that this is within the context of the parent element. So it's assuming that this button with the ID of name is actually in fact inside of the element that's associated with the view. So here we're actually listening for click events on a button with the ID of name that's inside of the element with the ID of dog. So that's just the property name for the particular event that we're trying to select and listen for clicks on. And then as the value of this particular property, we just pass it a string, and the string just has to match another method that exists within our view. So here you can see that we just give it the string render, which points to this render function here. Okay, so whenever we click the button with the ID of name that's inside of the element with the ID of dog, it's going to then run the render method, which will create a variable called name. And that's going to be set equal to this.model.getName. So remember, we have a model that we've already ahead of time pre-established a model relationship with this view. Okay, we'll see a good clean example of this in the upcoming code exercise, so don't worry about that too much. But essentially here we're pointing to this.model, and the model property is pointing back to the model associated with this view, so it would be the dog model. And then we're calling get to get the name property off of that model. And then in order to render this in the DOM, we're selecting this.$el. So remember, el points to the element associated with this view. In this case, it's been set to the ID of dog. And again, because we put the $sign in front of it, this is shorthand where it actually makes a jQuery selection object of this element, which is hashtag dog. So now we have a jQuery selection object here of the element with the ID of dog. And we're going to use the text method in jQuery to replace the text inside of that element. And we're going to set it to be the same as the dog's name. So as I mentioned, we can also render views using a template library. So here, assuming that we've set up a model that's associated with this view. And in this case, we've sort of just passed in this generic variable of dog. But assuming we've established a relationship between a model and this view, then it's very easy to grab the properties of this dog, all of the attributes of this dog, and pass it into a template that's actually ready for that information to be filled in. So in order to associate a template with our view instance, what we do is we use the property template. And here Backbone is very flexible because you can use any template library to grab that HTML template and then insert into it whatever properties exist on your dog. So in this case, we're actually using the underscore template. So here we have underscore dot template. So the template method is what we're calling here on the underscore object, which you can see here in the underscore library. We indicate the underscore object here using an actual literal underscore. So we say underscore dot template, and what we do is we pass in here all of the HTML content from a particular template. So somewhere inside of my index page, I actually have a template sitting there with the ID of dog-tpl, and then I'm calling the jQuery HTML method on it to get all of the HTML elements inside of this template. Okay. And then when I call render, what I do is I refer to this.$el, and that gives me again a jQuery selection object of the element associated with this view. And then I call .html on it to replace the HTML content of the element associated with this view. And what I replace it with is I actually call the template method here. So I do that by saying template this.model.attribute. So in this case, dog is our model associated with this view. So here we're passing in all of the attributes of that dog. So inside of underscore, we can then use shorthand to pass in, for example, the name of the dog, the age of the dog, all sorts of pieces of information about that dog, and that will automatically write the correct information into the correct elements in our HTML template. Okay, so again, we'll see another example of this coming up, but the important things here are simply just to look at the template property here, which stores a template. Okay, so this is some HTML code that has placeholders where we can then automatically, or in other words, dynamically fill in properties of our model. And then the way we actually sort of like spit out that template, but with the correct information from our model's attributes, is we call the template method, and then in parentheses here, we pass in the particular model instance's attributes. So if we have something called name inside of our template, it's going to replace name with whatever the model's name is. So if the dog's name was Fido, you might get, a paragraph template, and then where the name attribute is, it would replace that with Fido. So this gives us a really flexible way to dynamically pass in model attributes into a pre-built HTML markup template. So lastly, it's good to know how to create new instances of views. And just in the same way that we created instances of models and collections, we use the new keyword and we use the constructor name. So here we're just creating a variable called dog view and setting it equal to a new dog with a capital D, view with a capital V, dog view constructor. So now that we've explored the syntax a bit, to help put this into greater context, let's go ahead and take a look at a real code example.